welcome back everybody to the Book of Fables. We've got something really interesting planned for this week, and so I hope you enjoy it. The particular fairy tale that we're going to be talking about is one that we have just met. It is the Frog Prince, who shows up as Flycatcher in The Wolf Among Us. And I found a really interesting resource. It is the website of one Jessie Chen, and despite it being the most Windows 1995 web page maker thing I've ever seen, all tiled backgrounds with watermarks still on them and little animated GIFs and everything, it's wonderful. It also has some extremely excellent analysis of fairy tales, and so for that I am very grateful to her. I would recommend that you check out her website. I will put the link in the video. But what I thought we would do this time is take a look at some cross-cultural analysis. Now, I know that we've talked before about how a lot of these fairy tales seem to bridge cultures and show up in a lot of different places in a lot of different cultures and settings, but I haven't actually gone into very much how that plays out and how the tales are different and how they reflect the societies that they came from. So this is an excellent version. We will be going over the German, Korean, and Chinese versions of the Frog Prince. Now the basic story is more or less the same. There is a frog who is secretly a human, cursed in some sense, or magicked in some way, to be a frog. The frog wants to marry a princess. The princess, there's some barrier. Sometimes the princess is not too keen on the wedding. Sometimes the father-in-law, the king or nobleman, is not too keen on the wedding. The frog must overcome the obstacles, transforms into a human, and then wins the princess in some way. So, let's briefly sketch the three stories, and then we'll talk about what they say about the culture, because it does say quite a bit. In the German version, the frog is a prince, in fact. He's been cursed by a witch and remains a frog. The princess of the kingdom goes down to the pond where the frog is, and she's got this golden bauble, just a little trinket that she likes to play with, which she loses and falls into the swamp. She wants it back quite badly, but can't get it because she would get dirty and she's a princess, etc., etc. The frog promises to go get it if he will be her sweetheart, and she will take him in as her boyfriend or fiancé or whatever the medieval equivalent of that would be. She agrees, somewhat hastily. Frog gets it for her, and then she is none too keen on the arrangement, but her father, the king, says she must stick to what she promised. So, when he's around, she is sweet to the frog, but when he's away, she's kind of a jerk, closes the door on him, makes him knock all day, throws him against a wall, calls him horrid frog, and things like that. However, he is persistent and slowly wears her down. She allows him to sit on her knee, sleep under her pillow, things like that. If we're going to go for a Freudian tack, fairly suggestive movements towards the bedroom. However, eventually she comes to care for the frog, gives it a smooch, and in Beauty and the Beast style fashion, he then transmorphizes into a human, says he's been cursed. The king is overjoyed, for whatever reason. I guess he's a prince, so it's a convenient marriage. They marry and they live happily ever after. Now, the one thing that the Korean and Chinese stories have distinct from the European story is that the frog is not a prince in either of them. He's a commoner, and he desires a relationship with someone who's above his station, so he's not only separated by species, but also by socioeconomic level. In the Korean version, he was found by a fisherman and was sort of taken home and raised as their own. I guess he saw that the frog would talk or something like that, and is just a really clever frog, whereas in the Chinese version, a farmer gets his wife pregnant, leaves on a business trip. While he's gone, she gives birth to a frog instead of a human child. When he comes back, he's enraged and is all ready to throw it into a swamp, I guess, or something like that. When the frog demonstrates he has a variety of fairly ill-defined magical and martial prowess, he then decides to keep the frog and raise him as his own. So, in the Chinese and Korean versions, as I've said, a lot of the difficulty comes in rising above one's social status. In the Korean version, part of the reason the frog decides to raise himself up is to benefit his parents. he has these very strong familial ties, and he desires to raise his family status as well as to marry the princess. And so he asks his mother to go initiate a courtship between himself and, it's actually not really a princess, a nobleman's daughter. So she does, and the nobleman is having none of it. He is furious, beats the mother, and sends her home. And so the frog takes it upon himself to convince this person that his house has been cursed and will remain cursed by magical entities until he accepts the frog. So he does things like ties a lantern to the foot of a hawk, which flies around at night, making these fiery shapes in the sky, and causes various mischief around the house, breaking pots and things like that, convincing the nobleman, as I said, that his house is under some sort of curse. He buys into it hook, line, and sinker, and tells his youngest daughter, he has 3 daughters, the oldest 2 fly from their room in rage when he says they should marry a frog. The youngest one obeys the father and agrees to marry the frog, at which point he turns into a man. And really interestingly, at this point, he ascends to heaven, basically. There is an old man who has white hair, and this may be a familiar character in Korean mythology that I'm not actually familiar with. What it said, the bridegroom stripped off his toad skin and became a man, waved his hand in the air, then a white-haired old man appeared, and he bade him bring 100 deer. When the deer came, he drove them homeward, then he released all the deer and rose up to heaven, carrying his bride on his back and his parents on his arms. So that is a fairly strong emphasis both on cleverness, used to ascend the social order, which normally would be completely inaccessible, and also on familial piety and these strong family ties, that even in the end he is as concerned with his parents' welfare as he is with his own and that of his bride. It's very interesting. Also, in contrast, then we have the Chinese version. And at this point, there is a lot of unrest going on in the kingdom. The king the emperor is fighting against invaders from all these different sides. And the frog has got absolutely some magical powers. So the king then says, anyone who defeats this invading army which is coming in is allowed to marry my daughter. And the frog volunteers. He devours fire for 3 days and 3 nights, eats, it says, until his belly is as big and round as a bladder full of fat. And the city is in great danger by this point. The emperor is apprehensive. And once the 3 days and 3 nights are finished, he goes to this top of the city wall and looks at the situation. He sees thousands of soldiers and horses around. The gate opens, the invaders pour in, and the frog sits up and then vomits out all the fire, which incinerates the entire army, which is kind of a big deal. That's better than some tricks by the Korean one, I guess. Anyway, when this happens, the emperor has no intention of marrying his daughter to a frog, because that's a person of low standing, in addition to a farmer. And so he changes the requirements. And he says, oh, well, military prowess are one thing, but it's also this other contest. And the contest varies. Sometimes it's an eating contest, sometimes it's a swimming contest, something like that. But using his strong magical powers, the frog is able to win the competition fairly easily. And the king changes things again, and he says, oh, well, it's not just the contest, it's only open to humans. That no animals are allowed to participate. And at this point, the frog shows that he is able to take off his frog skin at certain nights of the year. And so he does so, and appears to the princess and to the king, and says, oh, I'm a magical being, I can take off my skin this way. And the king says, well, why don't you take off the frog skin, permanently and just stay as a man all the time? And the frog, becoming clever again, says, oh, the frog skin gives me eternal life as long as I wear it every day. Not true, but he says that. The emperor is suddenly very interested and says, well, let me wear the frog skin. And the frog prince sort of connivingly says, oh, sure, go ahead, put it on. He puts it on. Wouldn't you know it, the dawn breaks. And the emperor, not really knowing how to work the magical frog skin, is then trapped as a frog forever. the Frog Prince goes ahead with the marriage and reigns as emperor. So what's interesting is there is some conniving and growing in the social order in the Korean version, but there's a stronger sense of unrest, political turmoil, and finally triumph through both personal power and political maneuvering in the Chinese version, which is extremely appropriate for a large, tumultuous empire like China has been, that would have seen so many uprisings and wars and the opportunity for advancement and growth. Whereas the idea of a stultified social order that you really couldn't ascend would have appealed and been more understandable to both Korean and Western European listeners. The other interesting thing that I think there is the depiction of women as it happens in all three of the stories. In the Western, in the Grimm's fairy tale, the bride, the woman, is at the same time the most liberated and the most repressed. She's the most liberated because she's given the most agency. It's known what her opinions are about the frog, and she's able to, huck him against a wall and keep him out, and shows her will in a lot of different areas, and makes deals with the frog when her father isn't around. I mean, she's the one who originally agrees to the whole bargain. But at the same time, she's also fairly repressed because the king makes her do things against her will. He says, if you promised this, then this is what you must do. And so that appeals to both the romantic sense that there is in these medieval tales, that romance is something to be sought after and something which is more important, say, than what any of the individuals in a relationship might want. And also to the heroic bent, which is if you make a promise, you must absolutely keep it. And so the moral to be taken away from the German Grimm's fairy tale version of the story is, through keeping your word and through the idea of romance, then you can eventually find your happily ever after, your prince. Things will work out in the end, if only romance and chivalry are followed. In the Korean version, again, as I said, the real moral is a person who stays true to their family and who uses their cleverness and their ability to advance them can find success in that way. I mean, he is eventually granted entry into the house, which is far beyond his social standing, but he's shown as a hero as never forgetting his parents and even bearing them up on his arms. His wife is on his back, but his parents are on his arms, almost above her, as he ascends into heaven. And so it's a society which values responsibility and family togetherness more than either of the other two stories, which I think is very interesting. I mean, in the Western European one, there is a strong emphasis on basically forgetting your parents. In most of the happily ever afters, if the parents are mentioned, it'll be in a little parenthetical, like, oh yeah, they were living in the castle too. But the real emphasis is on the young couple, which is newly in love. And these family ties are not broken, but kind of ignored. People frequently leave their house and go off to find their fortune. And in the Chinese version, again, the emphasis is put on individual effort and on the maneuvering and politicking and power gaining of the frog, of the individual, and the idea that the truly heroic person is able to use all of the gifts and abilities that they have, and through using them will ascend to power. Now, so we were talking about women too. In the Korean version, really the only thing mentioned about the princess, the nobleman's daughter, is that she is the one who agrees to her father's demand that somebody needs to marry the frog. So her, the heroine in the story is simply the obedient daughter. And that is seen as her virtue, and her beauty isn't described at all, but her status is important, and her position in society. So in a way, that's a much less free position. I mean, she's not really given any agency, and her only positive trait is that she allows herself to be commanded, whereas the other two daughters didn't. And it's in fact even more restricted in the Chinese version, where the daughter of the emperor is basically his chess piece, and it's not suggested that she has any kind of free will, she's not really mentioned at all. She's just kind of there as an object to be fought over, a political bargaining chip. So At the one hand, I mean, you could say that she's not forced into doing things that she doesn't want to, but that's only because it's assumed that she doesn't want anything in particular, that she will do whatever she's told. And so, to me, that is an extremely interesting snapshot into some of the cultures and the traits which would have been valued by the European, Korean, and Chinese cultures, and how this single story can take on these different forms based on what people understand, and it shows how fairy tales can be an excellent window into sort of the cultural mores of a civilization. So thanks for listening, and I will catch you guys next time on the Book of Fables.